evening, everyone.
Evening.
Good evening. And a huge welcome to you all to our author discussion on South Asian literature. My name is Archana Sharma, and I'm the founder and CEO of Neem Tree Press. Before I hand over to my wonderful colleague Yasmin, I wanted to provide context for this discussion. We are, of course, going to be discussing a very small sliver tonight of what constitutes South Asian literature. This landmass is approximately, or actually greater than 21 times the landmass of the UK. It encompasses ancient civilizations and multiple countries. As commonly conceptualized, South Asia consists of Bangladesh, Bhutan, India, Maldives, Nepal, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, and sometimes Afghanistan is also included. Each of these countries has a vast number of languages. So to put it in context, today we are discussing literature in English that emanates from this area. And with that context, I will hand over to Yasmin.
Hi everyone, I'm Yasmin, otherwise known as Yaz. I'm part of the marketing team at Neem Tree Press, so I work closely with Archana, and I'll be chairing the discussion today. So we have a fantastic panel for you, three of our brilliant authors, Maithreyi Karnoor, Safinah Danish Elahi, and Taha Kehar. Maithreyi is a poet, award-winning translator and writer based in Bangalore, India, and the author of Sylvia. Safinah is a lawyer, poet, publisher, and writer based in Karachi, Pakistan, and the author of The Idle Stance of the Tippler Pigeon. And Taha is a novelist, journalist, and educator, also based in Karachi, Pakistan, and the author of No Funeral for Nazia. Thanks all for joining. I guess to kick us off, it would be great if each of you could give us a brief introduction to your books. So maybe starting with Safinah.
Hi everyone, thank you Neem Tree Press for hosting this wonderful panel. Very happy to be doing this. So my book, The Idle Stance of the Tippler Pigeon, just was released in the UK in July. I've got a copy here. So very excited, still a new baby out in the world. The book deals with, it's a multi-character story. It deals with three children, two of whom are siblings. One is their help's daughter. The story revolves around their childhood, and the narration is from past and present. So we see them growing up and then their adult versions from Karachi, Lahore, and London. And I discuss class divisions, income disparity, a little bit of gender roles, harassment. I don't want to say too much and not hog too much time. So I think over to the next.
Over to Maithreyi.
So yeah, thank you. It's great to be here and good to talk to you all after having communicated over email for a long time. This is my book, Sylvia, which is beautifully produced by Neem Tree Press. This is my debut novel, although I've been published as a translator and a poet before. I've tried quite a few things in this book. The plot is mainly about this man of Indian origin, a Goan origin person who was born in the Indian diaspora in Africa, raised in the UK, who comes back to trace his roots, to look for his home and his story and his family in Goa. But then he also has this very troubled relationship with his own family because of his sexuality. There he meets, the protagonist of the novel is Sylvia. There he meets this woman, Sylvia, but she is related to him. And he doesn't know of her presence, he doesn't know of her existence. And she turns up, and it's all about coincidences, tying things together. And how the relationship evolves, and then again they move away after a while. And I've done this experiment where in the second part of the novel, Sylvia becomes a secondary character in the lives of other people. So she's constantly evolving in the background, whereas these people come to the front and lay out their narratives, but you know she's there and she's evolving. And then it all comes together in the end. So I don't want to say more again, like Safinah. But that's basically my book. And I've experimented a lot with language and poetry in prose in this book.
Thank you, Maithreyi. And Taha, to finish us off.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you so much, Neem Tree Press. My book is No Funeral for Nazia, and I'll put it very simply. It's about a woman whose final wish is that once she dies, she doesn't want a funeral, she wants a party. So the entire book is about one evening where this party takes place, and it's all about what happens at that party. And it's set in Karachi. It's set against the backdrop of it's contemporary Karachi, but it deals so much with politics in the 80s and the 90s in flashback, and that's all I can tell you so far. So, yeah.
Thank you very much. So I guess just jumping back into the past slightly, I wanted to get an idea of the personal motivation that led you all to pursue writing. So I guess if you were able to share a particular moment or experience that first inspired you to become writers, and tell us also a bit about how your South Asian heritage and living respectively in Pakistan and India influenced this. If we could start back with you, Taha.
Okay, so I can't really pinpoint the exact moment when I decided to become a writer. I do remember having this desire to tell stories and to hear stories. So there was this curiosity about the art of storytelling that led me to just discover new stories. And I think for me, I sought comfort in a book because I was really interested in the way I think this is all me thinking now in retrospect, but I suppose I was very fascinated by the way words appeared on paper and how they became a measure of your imagination. And I just found it really interesting, which is why I was drawn towards books. But I think for me as a writer, I never really had this desire to produce a South Asian novel or a Pakistani novel because the writing I was exposed to as a child was purely, British writing, the classics. We were fed them like it was a staple diet of the classics, which was great. But it influenced my creative sensibilities in such a way that I began writing about people with English sounding names strutting about Karachi. So there would be like, little orphan Annie walking down the streets of Karachi, and we would never encounter someone like that here. So for me, the turning point came when I think I was 12 or 13, and I picked up a book. It was called The God of Small Things by Arundhati Roy. Everybody knows it. And I remember the first sentence: May in Imanam is a hot, brooding month. And 12-year-old me is thinking, oh, wow, I wonder what part of Britain Imanam is in. And then I realized it's not set there. It's set in a world not very similar to mine, but very much in the same, cultural milieu. And that's when I started thinking about writing characters that were like me. And now that I think about it, I think it's very difficult for me to write about someone with an English sounding name without having the crutch of a South Asian character. If I were to write about somebody, that person would need to have like a Pakistani friend or an Indian friend or something like that. So I think for me, it started off with this desire for storytelling, and it just went forward from there.
Oh, that's so interesting. I guess leading on to Maithreyi, can you relate to that? Did you have a similar experience?
Yeah, I have a feeling there's going to be some kind of trend that's going to emerge from here, because I think everyone who ends up being a writer starts off as an early reader, somebody who's had a very early relationship with stories. So I think I can kind of relate to Taha's experience with just the details change. I was very lucky that I grew up in a small town, and we had few distractions. I didn't have a TV in my house until I was about 12 years old. So stories and reading was pretty much all there was. My mom was a great storyteller. My grandfather was an excellent storyteller. And we were all readers in our family. So, my relationship with books started very early on. And I think once you've kind of learned to take pleasure out of words, the next progression, the next step is to try and put words together yourself. So I started writing very early, and I used to send my stories in, I I would tear out pages from my school notebook and write stories in them, and I would send them to magazines. And I was encouraged to do that by my parents. So there's this children's comic book magazine called Tinkle in India, and the first story of mine was published when I was around 12 years old, and I received a princely sum of 120 rupees for it. And that was so encouraging, so exciting. It was just an amazing feeling. And I kept doing that. But funnily enough, while my parents were very encouraging of my writing as a child, later they tried to get me to think of it more as a hobby and not really an occupation. I was quite discouraged from thinking of it in more serious terms. So I won't bore you with the details, but to cut a long story short, I did keep writing. I did keep reading as much as I could, and at university, I had the chance to translate some literature, and that was amazing. It brought back my creative instinct, and I started writing again. And so I started off after this long gap. I started off as a translator first, and translation is something that helps you engage with language at this very, very deep level, and it's so creative that it was. I actually think my translation experience was my own personal MFA of sorts, because that helped me hone my voice, and then fiction and poetry was the next logical step, I think.
Thank you for that. And Safinah?
Yeah. I think the similarity is that I've also been an early reader. Most text was Western, when I was 8 or 9, I was reading high school series, and it just seemed, such a different world from where I was living at. I don't belong to a literary family. The only person reading in my house was my dad. So I would sneak into his study and just kind of grab whatever I could get my hands on. But I do remember when I wrote my first novel, which was published in Pakistan, I do remember the exact moment when I've been a young mother. So I was sitting at my daughter's sports day, and I saw these parents sort of. So the first novel is about, just a little bit, a quick brief is about helicopter parenting. And I was sitting there at the sports day, and the parents were really worked up. They were on the benches, they were pushing their children, they were scolding their children. And those third graders didn't really care much about winning or losing, the race. And I just saw so much happening there that I was like, nobody's talking about this. Why are these parents so involved in the child's winning rather than just sort of encouraging competition and sports like a good parent should? And then obviously I got deeper into telling my story. And the story revolves around 3 families and how they're interlinked, and it's a little bit dramatic as well. But I think what I was trying to do was get attention to a small bubble in Karachi, which somehow at the time was being ignored because of mostly Pakistani stories being about terrorism or even politics. So this just seemed like something I knew of, and the first novel always comes from things I couldn't talk about things that I had not experienced at that point. And I also was a preschool teacher, so I had parents all around me, parents as a teacher, I was a parent myself, I was socializing with parents. So just the, sort of ideas that were coming, gave birth to the first novel. And I don't think I intended to write a very Pakistani story, but I think elements of culture and elements of, Pakistani habits do come in when you're writing.
Mm-hmm. That's a great segue into my next question, which is about how location influences and shapes perspectives as a writer. So yeah, really interested to know for all of you in terms of like how important you think it is to incorporate certain elements, like Safinah said about culture, whether that be heritage or politics. So yeah, Taha, if you could give your insight on that one.
So So when it comes to adding that South Asian element or that Pakistani element into the story, I never really felt the need to add this just for the sake of anthropology or just for sociological significance, because I feel we're telling stories here. And we're thinking in terms of characters, we're thinking in terms of what people are doing in their lives. So I don't think I consciously do it. Perhaps, subconsciously it happens, I suppose. Karachi features in most of the books I've written so far, and it's a specific segment of Karachi society. More often than not, when people have written about Karachi in a fictional sense, at least in the last 20 years, it's been with regard to the violence, the terrorism, the political instability. And while I like to touch on that, I do want to talk about things that happen within the private sphere, what's happening at home, how are people reacting? Because one of the things I realized at one point was that even though we were living through those very difficult times, life kept going on. So I think it's best that we focus on what was happening to us in those narratives. So as far as adding a South Asian element, or in terms of the politics, in terms of the way people react to it, that's just my focus here. I try to focus more on women and how their stories are often being neglected in these narratives. I also try to draw attention to human relationships, not just love, but the idea of how love can change you, how it can affect your loyalties. When does it become transactional? When does it become chaotic? And for me, those are more important than actually inserting elements of South Asia into the narrative. But they seep in their own way. Yeah.
Thank you. And Maithreyi?
Yeah, well, I suppose it's very similar for me as well. My stories, my characters are from India. They're set here because that is all I know, because that's where I've lived all my life. But also because thanks to my reading was my periscope to the outside world. It has given me this sort of objective distance and a way of observing things critically, which I think has helped me in my intuitive process about writing, in how I write about the people I see around me. So on the one hand, I don't like to exoticize. I'm not thinking of a Western reader and explaining things for somebody who wouldn't relate to them, because I'm really just writing for myself. And the biggest tool for me is irony. I look for the irony in things because it's all around us, in the way we live our lives, in the paradoxes that we inhabit, and they find their way into my writing. For me, language is as big a character as the protagonist of my novel. I come from a small town, and thanks to its geographical locations, I come from a Kannada speaking family. I come from Karnataka, where Kannada is the primary language, but also because where it's located, and its history, there's always a mix. It's very, very heterogeneous. There is Kannada, of course, and I hear a lot of Marathi spoken on the streets because it used to belong to the Bombay state earlier. And because of the Adil Shahi dynasty, there is a lot of Urdu spoken, and it just enters the language without us even knowing that it's a different language, So growing up with that rich linguistic kind of mixture gives you a keen ear for the ironies going on around you, and that just easily, naturally finds its way into my stories without me having to think about it consciously. In fact, I try not to think about it consciously because then it feels artificial. So, my way to write is to observe, be a fly on the wall, just observe and use my love for language to bring the stories out. And that is how I relate to my South Asian heritage, and that's how I write.
Thank you. Yeah, that's really interesting. And your point about language, and in the sense of you writing not for a Western audience necessarily, leads very well into my next question, which is about your general feelings about language in your books, and thinking about things like glossaries and italicizing words, basically with that reader in mind who might be less familiar with those languages, and kind of, I guess, in some ways trying to educate in that way. Do you feel like it's important or necessary? It's something which is being discussed quite widely at the moment, in terms of making text accessible. But it would be great to get your thoughts on that. I guess, yeah, going back to you, Maithreyi, if you could start.
Okay. I am kind of divided on the whole glossary thing myself. On the one hand, I think the biggest strength of the English language is its malleability and its the ease with which borrowed words enter the language. The English dictionary is much richer than what it was 100 years ago. Now, new words keep entering it from all over the world. And it keeps evolving that way. And I see, English words from different parts of the world tend to bring in the flavor of that language with so much ease and with no need for any explanation, because you can always make contextual meanings of what is, even if you don't know what exactly a word means, you can know what is being implied through the context. And that is done with, an Irish writer writing in English, or someone from the southern state of America writing in English, or somebody with a Mexican background. So it's, that sort of African literature, it's all there. So, you don't really feel the need to explain, because there is a certain kind of power dynamics in language too. If you take it in your stride, it means you are relating to that power equation on your own terms. But at the same time, as a debut novelist, I also have to be a little careful. I don't want to render my work too obscure or opaque, because I am reaching out to readers. I want to be read. So it's a fair balance there. On the one hand, you want to kind of hold on to that identity, but you also want to be accessible and approachable. So I think it's okay to begin with some kind of glossary. I think in the glossary in my book, a lot has been explained, but a lot has also not been has been left untouched, because I would like to give my readers that respect, to expect and expect them to engage with it without having everything handed to them. Right. So
yeah, if I can just interrupt here. So Maithreyi, particularly in your book, you were as you sort of mentioned, there were more than one language that was used, and so actually for someone who is from South Asia, it was still incredibly useful to have that glossary. So sure. I think it's, again, we come to this vast place that is South Asia, this vast place that is, India, and Pakistan, of course, has numerous languages. And so I think that glossaries are not just, quote unquote, for the Western reader. Often they are just very useful for the reader. So,
Yeah, of course. Yeah, I agree.
Back to you, yes.
Safinah and Taha, do you have anything to add in terms of language? And that's
fascinating, because there are different languages that we speak, the languages that we learn as in Pakistan and India. There's the medium of instruction, which is usually English. Then there's the language which we learn at home, which is usually our secret language, something that it's not just Urdu, it could be a regional language. And then there are languages that are in the air, if you think about it. Stuff you hear in music, and you just pick up these words here and there. And there's obviously the language of commerce. You need to know it just to, conduct your business. You'll never be able to write in these languages that are in the air, but you have exposure to them. So one would argue, with so much, linguistic exposure, how much do you need to explain? I mean, I'm also sort of on the fence about this, because I feel that you can't assume knowledge. You can't assume everyone has the same experiences as you, which is why a glossary makes sense. And then the other thing is, I mean, we're writers, and I mean, we have to sort of, vie for attention from our readers. I mean, realistically speaking, we're competing with Netflix. And I recall a few months ago watching 1899, the show which had different people speaking in different languages, and I wouldn't have been able to watch that so without subtitles. So I mean, I'm not saying that glossaries serve as subtitles for our books. There are certain things that defy explanation, but they do open up a closed world. And I think that makes sense. And as far as my book was concerned, I mean, the title says it all. I'm dealing with death. You have to be really morbid to know the intricacies of the rites and rituals that are performed in Pakistan or anywhere in the Muslim world when a person dies. So some things do need explanation. But while I was writing my glossary, oddly enough, there were certain words that were used that I didn't realize we were misusing them, like the word beta, which means son. And there's another word, beti, which means daughter. We use beta for men and women for some strange reason, whereas there is a distinction. So it really does tell you about the way we use languages generally. There's a patriarchal influence, and there are some things that I feel can be explained. But then, as I said, I'm still a little bit on the fence about it because I've never written a glossary for another book. I did do a glossary for a book, but that was just, purely on the basis of geography, like where does the character go? And that was more like a brochure of sorts. So yeah.
Thank you. And Safinah, would you agree, or do you have a slightly different?
Yeah, so I think I would take italicizing. There's a twofold answer to it. There's an international debate where writers say that why should they italicize, and the readers should be smart enough, and if they don't understand something, they can just do a quick Google search. And why should there be a glossary? At the same time, I feel like a lot of readers, there was a moderator in Berlin who asked me why I had decided to use Urdu words and not just translated those words within the text. And he said that, the glossary really helped him because, every time he'd get through a sentence and he wouldn't understand something, he would just flip through the glossary. And it was just kind of fun seeing the translations there as well. So it definitely is useful. I think initially, when most writers around me were talking about it, I didn't have much of an opinion until I put a glossary for Tippler. I think there should be definitely a glossary for books that have more than one language. Also, I remember reading a book that was by a South Asian writer, and it kept saying Brother Ali, Brother Ali. And till I reached the middle of the book, I just kept hearing myself saying Brother Ali. And I'm like, why does the writer keep saying Brother Ali? And I realized that it's Ali Bhai, and it's out of respect that you call an elder person in Pakistan as Bhai. So Bhai, Chacha, this is just a form of respect. And when you use, another word for it that's translated, it doesn't really convey the message. So middle of the book, I'm like, oh, so he means Ali Bhai because he's older. So that I kind of lost when it was translated. And which is why I think I took the decisions to use Urdu words in Tippler, because they just made sense.
Thank you. Slightly different question now. I basically just wanted to get a sense of the literary scene in India, Pakistan. So if you're able to tell us a bit about what that looks like now, how you think it's evolved over the years, where you see it heading. Back to you, Safinah, if you'd like to open us with that one.
It's an interesting question for me because I run Reverie Publishers as well in Pakistan. So I actually see all kinds of writing that has been coming up. Some of it is brilliant, some of it is not. So everybody who emails me obviously wants to aspire to be a writer. They also are in a position that I guess I was in, where you think that authors are some mythical creatures, and you somehow jump from 2 pages to 300 pages. The literary scene in Pakistan is very exciting right now. I think the older writers who have kind of graduated from their 4 or 5 novels and have done tremendously internationally as well, We see a new, sort of young stream of writers coming up with really great stories. Again, I feel like it's not as much for a Western audience, like it's not written for a Western audience. It's usually stories from Pakistan that need attention. Like Taha said earlier, we've been known to be a violent city. Karachi has always had something going on. But somehow we go on and we live our lives and we sort of, water our plants, have a playground day with the kids. So we also have these ordinary lives with that music in the background. So I think some great stories are coming out and different stories are coming out. Stories that I think the West is also ready to embrace. As we see so many award winners from South Asia. And those stories are pretty, the Seven Moons of Mali Almeida is very Sri Lankan. There's a lot of Sri Lankan politics in it, which is initially very hard to take in. But, it's won the Booker. So I guess people are ready for it.
Absolutely. Taha, would you agree with that?
I completely agree. I think there is an exciting period ahead for Pakistani literature. One of the things I've noticed lately is that there are quite a few people writing in different genres. So back in the day, we had this focus on literary fiction. So everyone had to produce a particular kind of book for it to be recognized. But now I see books like mystery novels. There's something about fantasy, there's horror, ghost stories. So I like the fact that people are experimenting. Oddly enough, it doesn't seem like it's an experiment because this is what happens everywhere across the world. But the emphasis on literary fiction, I think it's gradually being reduced. But the best thing about the last 10 years in Karachi and other cities of Pakistan is that we have a lot of literary festivals that are taking place, and they're showcasing literature from across the board. As Safinah mentioned, we had the old guard, and now we have what I like to call the new guard. We are the new authors here, and there's something different about what we have to offer. But I think with time, things also need to evolve. The assumption is that the way we do literary criticism, that has to change as well, because I think it's geared towards literary fiction, and the way we assess literary fiction, we're using the same principles for a romance novel or mystery novels, and we're critiquing them for losing, for not showing any literary craft or skill or whatever you want to call it. So I think with time, all of these infrastructures need to change as well. And I think if we bring in the idea of publishing, we have new publishers. Safinah is on, she's in a better position to talk about this. But publishing has also, there's this boom that's happened recently, which is interesting. So yeah, it is an exciting period, and I do see it going in a positive direction in the next maybe 10, 15 years. I also feel that there were in Pakistan, when it comes to English, there were very few writers who were writing back in the day. So you knew 5 names of Pakistani writers. Now you probably know 15. But the likelihood is, hopefully, in the next maybe 20 years, you'll know 100, 200, and that's going to make it better for us. But then there are other things that one needs to think about, because we as writers are not making money from our writing usually. So is that discouraging? Is that where does that leave us? So there are lots of questions that still need to be answered.
Sure, makes sense. Thank you. Maithreyi, would you say there's been like a similar evolution in India in terms of the literary scene, or does it contrast from that?
So, no, I think it's fairly similar. While I'm quite optimistic about where Indian literature is going, I'm not that excited about readership, actually. I don't remember which critical theorist it was who said, all third world literature is national allegory. I suppose this applied to the early decades of after independence for most of our countries, where I think writers felt very compelled, and these were writers who were most often than not trained in the West, and trained in the literary sensibilities of the West, and they were trying to write about India or Pakistan or Sri Lanka or whatever in the formulas that they had learnt in their colleges and universities in London or wherever. So most often than not, the nation became a character there. It was so obviously present there at all times. And that has kind of changed a lot in the recent decades, because now we are talking to the world and we don't really put ourselves in silos anymore. So, many Indian writers are don't feel the need to write about India or set their stories in India. One of the writers I've been following quite keenly of late is Taha Kehar, and he's one of the most versatile writers, I feel. Each of his novels have a very, very different sensibility, because there are writers who keep writing the same novel over and over again, with just the details changed. Whereas I see more hope in terms of versatility from Indian writers, not just English writers, but Indian writers writing in Indian languages. This novel that I translated recently was by this Kannada author, and half of the novel is set in Portugal. So I think it's important and it's exciting to see authors willing to break these molds and take on there's always, English writers have never, by English writers, I mean, writers from England in particular, have never shied away from setting their novels in, say, Malaysia or Afghanistan or wherever. Whereas the other way around is like the empire talking back, and that has taken all these years for that sort of thing to evolve. So that's exciting. But readership, on the other hand, as Taha said earlier, we are competing with Netflix. So there is there are many things that are distracting a reader these days, and people seem to be in a hurry. There is the kind of engagement I had in my childhood with a book, to read deeply. That sort of thing, I think, is being eroded to a certain extent, and I don't know what the solution to that is, other than to just promote books and encourage reading more. So while on the one hand writing is happening really well, and the publishing scene is also a lot more optimistic, the readership thing needs a bit of a nudge, is what I feel.
Thank you. Yeah, my next question is about challenges. So I guess leading on from what you're saying, would you say in terms of competing for attention, that's one of the major challenges you've experienced throughout this journey of writing? And do you have any other broader challenges you've faced along the way to share?
Well, personally, one of the bigger challenges for me is to be taken seriously as a writer, coming from where I do. And I try not to airbrush away questions of class and caste, because they're there and we have to address them. But at the same time, I don't want my book to seem like a sociological lesson either, and overdo the anthropological element in it. But I am living through it, and I sense it, and I am quite sensitive to these things. So for me, just to decide that I am going to be a writer itself was a huge deal, and getting people to agree to it. All said and done, we are quite conservative in our society, even if individual families are different. And to be able to break that mold and come out of it, and to not live up to certain expectations, social expectations, itself took me a lot of courage and a lot of time to not let that bother me, and do what I like doing the most. That was the biggest challenge. And And I don't know if I've arrived yet. It's a journey, and I'm still on it. But I feel a lot freer than I used to be 10 years ago now.
Thank you. Taha, have you experienced similar challenges, or have your challenges sat slightly separately from that?
So oddly enough, the one thing that I've been told is that that you're doing something that is very niche. So imagine you have this creative universe that you exist in, you're writing your books, and then suddenly someone tells you that, okay, that's exotic, that's esoteric, that's niche, and suddenly everything is just, you question whether you're doing something wrong, whether you're doing something right. So the thing with me is, with even No Funeral, there's no bridge character. There's no, nobody who makes the story palatable. It's pretty much brown people in Karachi doing their thing. And I feel like maybe that lends it a kind of, a niche quality, which I feel is frowned upon, at least in the mainstream publishing world. So I remember hearing a lot of that, and it was nice though. I think it really does help you question, what you're doing. And there was a moment where I sat down and wondered, why do I only write about South Asians? Why do I only write about Karachi? Can I do something else? Should I broaden my canvas? So in a way, it's a challenge that eventually leads you to question certain things. And I believe as a writer, you have to keep evolving. You can't just do the same thing. So maybe it's also good to sort of know what crutches you have on with you, and how you can get rid of them. So it's worth thinking about like that as well. Again, I'm being very optimistic. So yeah.
Thank you. And Safinah, in terms of any major challenges?
Yeah, I think a challenge would be that the distance between the reader and the writer has increasingly reduced. And I see myself thinking that when I'm writing something, it's almost like, okay, I know that my friends are reading it. I know that my parents are reading it, so it's almost like a self-censor. Also, I feel like, I don't know if it's the same all over South Asia, but in Pakistan, I feel the writers almost held responsible to create an image of Pakistan, how we depict society or the evils of society should not be written about. And this is not a soft image of, where we live. And I personally don't think that this is our responsibility. I mean, I'm not a political spokesperson, and I'm not supposed to talk about only good things that happen in Pakistan. So I think that's a challenge, to be able to maneuver yourself through fiction. I mean, it's not even that I'm reporting. It's a story that, the reader is supposed to take on. Another challenge is when, so I have experimented with spaces, with places. My characters are from Karachi, Lahore, London, in Tippler. The new book that I'm working on is also based in Pakistan, the US, and Australia. So I have written in different spaces. They're mostly brown characters, but when one is not living somewhere else, it does become a bit of a challenge when you think about if a reader who has lived in Melbourne, for example, picks up my book and calls me out. So that's a challenge that I think the writer has. As much research as you do, you still want to appear authentic, but it's the risk of, trying out new stuff. So I think these are the two challenges that I face as a writer.
Thank you.
Yeah, if I may add something here, censorship, I think, is at its peak at the moment in South Asia, because everyone is an expert these days. Everyone considers themselves an authority on what should and should not happen. And there is a lot of labeling, name calling. Everything is black and white. This is left wing, this right wing, this pro, this anti that. And even people who haven't read the book will just decide to have some kind of judgment on it, either praise it or denounce it, book burning, attack the author. That sort of thing is quite rampant. And that is, I think that also leads to authors self-censoring their own voices for fear. my way of dealing, I mean, not that I have dealt with anything so contentious yet, but I do think about it a lot. And the way I deal with these things is through linguistic flair, keep it a little ambiguous so that nobody can actually, at least somebody who's not very literate, can point fingers and say, oh, she's anti this, let's go throw rocks at her house. That sort of thing. So irony is a good tool to keep things in the balance and not really come across as very strong in your opinions. That is one of the challenges, and that is how I face, and that is how I deal with it.
That's really interesting. Thank you. Yeah, also just thinking in terms of challenges or benefits of working with a UK publisher where your publisher isn't based where you are. How have you found that? Can you tell us a bit about that? I guess, yeah, back to you, Maithreyi.
I think it's tremendous what we can do with technology now. I mean, just the fact that we're sitting here, all of us in different countries, and talking to each other in real time itself has opened up lots of opportunities. I hate to think about earlier generations of writers who had to type out the manuscript, make several copies, and send it out to a publisher, and for a response that may never come. Even knowing that there's a publisher, having the addresses itself is a huge challenge. Whereas for us, it's a lot easier than that. But that said, even now, I feel a certain kind of reluctance from publishers in the UK to take on authors from different countries. It's as if they're stuck in the past. I've had rejections from publishers of poetry telling me, oh, we love your manuscript, but unfortunately we are only taking poets who are residents in the UK and Ireland, that sort of thing. So I feel they're unwilling to sort of tap into that, tap into the possibilities that technology offers. And it's really refreshing that Neem Tree Press has chosen to take this route, and I'm quite excited and happy and grateful to have had this opportunity.
Thank you very much. Safinah, would you be able to add to that in terms of your experience of working with a UK publisher?
I mean, it's been incredible so far. I think I was fortunate enough to come to the UK and promote the book and do some events around London and Berlin. I think it's been fantastic. Even pre-launch, I think the communication, like Maithreyi said, due to tech, has been pretty easy. We've had multiple Zoom meetings, via email. We've been it almost seemed like I knew most of the Neem Tree Press team by the time I already met you guys. And I think it's such a great support everybody's been. I had an excellent experience, but in terms of finding a publisher, I can imagine, and I have experienced the same, that it's not easy reaching out to US and UK publishers from Pakistan. Most writers I know have either done, courses somewhere, done their MFAs. I mean, I'm also enrolled in an MFA program, but it's online because my life and my kids are here. So it's not easy for me to, just kind of take my life out of Karachi and just go somewhere for months and, stay there and meet, publishers and agents. So I think accessibility is definitely a factor in trying to find the right home for your book. And I'm also very grateful to Neem Tree Press because I think NTP has been, great with diverse books and taking books on that other publishers might have had, just maybe an understanding kind of a situation where they don't know how the book will do. I mean, whenever I remember earlier on, if somebody asked me what my comps were, what my normal comps were, and I would be like, I don't know, I don't know who is going to read my story, because as a writer, you don't really think what your reader is like. You're just kind of putting the story out. But I think the entire process with Neem Tree helped it be palatable to UK readers and readers globally.
Yeah, if I can just intervene. So I think in support of UK publishers, of which we are one, I think it's not really that we're not interested. And of course, Neem Tree Press is absolutely interested in South Asian literature, but it's really the issue of marketing a book. So as we all know, as authors and publishers, it is one thing to publish a book and quite another thing to market it. So having people on the ground, having authors on the ground makes a difference. So I think part of it is really an economics issue. And Taha, I totally understand what you're saying. You know, can one make a living from writing? And I would say that that's not just a South Asian problem, that's a global problem. And I would go as far as to say, you know, even as a publisher, you know, can we make this a viable business for the long run? And as we all know, margins are really short and all that. So I think that some of the decisions that get made on whether non-UK and non-US authors get platformed is not because of lack of interest in the stories that are coming from there, but really just the practicality of it. And of course, there's more translations now that are being published. So I just want to, you know, have sort of some defense of the Western publishing industry there. So.
And Taha, would you agree with that?
I completely agree. So at the end of the day, it is a business. It's something that we cannot ignore. So as far as my experience is concerned, I feel there has to be a little bit of distance between the publisher and the author. And not that I'm insisting that there should be a vast difference, but sometimes a little bit of distance helps. Because if I've given you a manuscript, I trust you with it. And I'd like you to perform your alchemy and do what you have to do, and then, you know, produce this, which is just like, it's almost like magic for me, at least. But when it comes to marketing, we all have to join hands. We have to do this together. And yes, there are lots of things logistically that we need to deal with in terms of the fact that there is a time difference. I suppose, like, I was just thinking about this the other day, that if you guys tell me to do something by tomorrow morning, I have the extra 5 hours because, and I benefit from it. So in a way, I'm quite happy because I get more time to do it. But in terms of the marketing, I was also thinking about this in the sense that I've never had a book published in the UK. So I don't really know what that market is all about. But I know, like, there's certain things I'm used to doing in Pakistan or in India. And I often wonder if they can be replicated, if they can still apply. But that's just the thing. I think it's all about, you know, meeting each other halfway, which we've managed to do. So that's the best thing about it so far.
Yeah, and of course, you know, there's a lot more. Sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
I was going to say there's a lot of digital marketing now, of course, as the team will tell you. So I think I think that helps with globalizing voices. Really makes it a little bit easier. Yeah, so I will stop here.
It's also just the fact
I
that,
was just saying that I think it's just reaching a wider audience. You know, it's when you publish in your own country, you know that a handful of people are going to read this. But when you're able to reach out, you know, to a publisher that has the access to more readership, that's when you feel like you've done something. You know, your story has reached somewhere, and maybe, you know, out of that somewhere, it's going to make a difference to someone.
that's what we want to do. We just want our stories to be read. And beyond that, everything else is just secondary considerations. Because if someone comes up to me and say, oh, wow, we loved what you wrote, there will be, you know, a bit of an ego boost. I will be delighted to hear that, because I've slaved my way on that book for maybe a year or something like that.
Absolutely. Yeah, I guess leading on from that, my next question is about advice you'd give to aspiring South Asian writers who, I guess, are trying to find their voice and navigate the literary world, both within and outside of the South Asian context. So yeah, back to you, Safinah.
Yeah. I think my advice is going to be pretty generic. If you have a story to tell, first, I think first the writer needs to ask oneself, why do you want to tell that story? Why is that story important? And once you have a clear answer to that, you can continue writing, getting rejected, keep writing, keep reaching out. And I guess just persevere, don't think that it stops there. Don't think that like any writer has had success in their first submission. Just kind of keep at it.
Thank you. Maithreyi, would you give similar advice or something slightly different?
Absolutely similar. I would tell them to be patient. Mostly, yeah. It's a marathon and not a race. So you have to be patient. I would say don't be in a hurry to publish. A lot of young people. I was teaching creative writing in a college until recently, and everyone is in a hurry to publish. You have written one line and you think it's brilliant and you want to be out there. I would say wait, read more, read widely. It will give you better perspective. It will and sleep on your writing. So the next day you may not like what you've written. You may have evolved. You may have grown as a person and a writer. So give it time. Hone your skill. Gain your own voice. Don't imitate. People. Don't follow formulas. And be patient. And of course, keep pitching, keep writing, whatever. But be patient. It's not something. It's not a race. It's a marathon. That's basically it.
Thank you. And Taha, to finish us.
I have a slightly long-winded answer to this. So as far as finding your voice is concerned, I think there's a difference between writing for an audience and writing for yourself. And the one thing is that a writer should never stop writing for themselves. So when you're confronted with that Word document or Google Doc or whatever you want to call it, it's daunting because you know that at one point somebody's going to read it. And I feel like it's good to keep a little diary. Like I usually keep this with me every now and again. It's a tiny book that I scribble my thoughts into. And I realize that somehow the language of my mind, my heart, it goes into that as opposed to a book that I've written, which everyone is going to read. And it really helps you find your voice. And as far as navigating the literary world is concerned, we have to remember first that writing and publishing are very different things altogether. You could write a terrific book, but you could never find a publisher for it. There's always that possibility. Then once you're in that world, once you have that, coveted book deal, that there'll be lots of writers around you. They'll be like, oh, I got a 6-figure advance. Oh, I got this much money. I sold this. I sold that. You're not competing with them. You're competing with yourself. So if you've written a good manuscript and, it's getting published, great. Don't write the same book again. Write something completely different. Just keep innovating. Try to do something different. And it's okay to live balance. You don't need to write every single day of your life. There are times when you can just say, okay, I'm going to live now. And it's always good to have something else that you enjoy as well. Like, you might want to, be a tax accountant or something else as your day job, because that when you get caught up in the business of living, you actually come up with the best stories because it's like doing research. So never lose sight of yourself in that race, as Maithreyi said, to excel. Yeah.
Thank you. I guess on that, if you're able to tell us if you're working on anything exciting at the moment in terms of upcoming writing projects.
Who's the question for? Sorry.
Oh, anyone. I was asking Taha, but anyone can jump in.
Anyone
Yeah,
can go
Maithreyi,
ahead,
want to kick us off?
Yeah, sure. I'm writing my second novel and third book actually, because I've already finished a collection of short stories. I'm waiting for that to be published. And this time I've decided to write it in Kannada. It's a huge challenge for me, really. Although it's my first language, I've never written in Kannada before. I've always written in English. But this time, it's just like my first book, Sylvia. This character of Baobab just jumped at me. It's a word play there. Bao is Konkani for brother, and Bab is like sir, and I put that together and it sounded like a baobab tree, and I created a whole character out of it, and then the whole novel came out of it. Similarly, this time the the title for my Kannada novel sort of jumped at me again. It's wordplay based on a very popular Kannada drama. So because the title came in Kannada, I felt obliged to write the novel in Kannada as well. But at the same time, because I write in English, I'm constantly thinking of translating it myself. So I'm kind of thinking in two languages while I work at it. And it's going to be very different from my first book. Hopefully it'll be done in the next 5 or 6 months. That's what I'm working on. I don't want to say more because, you know, I feel that
don't give it all away. That sounds very interesting. Thank you. Safinah, what about you?
So I started writing something while I was at the IWP program in Iowa. And I think that kind of gave me a chunk of time to sit with a story. Usually what happens is I start writing something and then I lose track and then I just chug it because I feel like it's not good enough to be taken to novel length. But there I had a lot of time. I had a lot of writing inspiration. I had writers all around me. And Iowa is a very quiet place, so it helped me really get into the story. I've somewhat finished the first draft, somewhat, it's really messy. I want to just print it out and, you know, see how bad it is. But the story is, it's focusing on mental health, and it's about 4 friends. And I'm just kind of working with the timeline as I did with Tippler. I somehow feel like, you know, there's chunks here and then there's a chunk somewhere and then I don't know what happens in the middle and I just need to put it all together. So right now it's just this messy thing that hopefully I'll put together soon.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm sure it will piece together very soon. And Taha, are you working on anything at the moment?
Oddly enough, at the moment, I'm just researching a book at the moment. Sometime last year, I was told that, oh, you seem to write women very well, but you don't really do justice to the men. And I said, okay, that's an interesting observation, and being a man. But I realized I didn't know much about male friendships because most of my friends were invariably women, and this has always been the case. So I had decided to write a book about male friendship, and I went through research. Right, I became friends with someone specifically for this reason. Obviously, told him everything. That okay, I'm doing this purely for research purposes. We will be friends. We will share experiences, and then I will write about it. And I think that's just the premise here. But obviously, a lot has come. A lot of insights have just come my way through that, and I'm trying to put all of that down. Obviously, I'm trying to give myself some time because I don't want to end up writing in the same voice as I did for No Funeral, because I would like it to be radically different, or I want to work with different narrative perspectives within the same book. So yeah, it's just still a work in progress.
Where on earth did you find this friend who was going to enter into this experiment with you? I just find it hilarious.
You call it an experiment, but I genuinely, it was just a casual conversation, somebody I knew, and I said, okay, are you up for it? And he said, sure. And it was great. It was dinners, it was, you know, going for walks, talking to each other. And invariably I felt like, you know, like what was the difference between me writing about a man and me writing about a woman? It's the same thing at least in this particular situation. But yeah, it feels almost manipulative to think about it. So.
Thank you for that insight. So yeah, on that note, we've wrapped up our main questions, but it's time to go to the Q&A. So everyone in the chat is welcome to pop any questions they have. We've already got some coming in, so we can start with those if everyone's happy with that. So the first one we've got in the chat, and we've got a few that were emailed over, so we'll jump into those as well. Okay, so this says, there aren't many UK publishers run by South Asian MDs or editors themselves. How important is it for an author to feel represented in their publisher's team? And will that help bring South Asian literature into the mainstream? If we can start with Safinah on this one.
I think when you have somebody on the team who understands your culture and your work, it is always helpful, because they're going to be able to navigate, and especially if there's a South Asian on the UK publishers team, then they already know what works in the UK and they somewhat know where you come from. So the editing process and then even the marketing process becomes easier. So definitely, I think it's great to have someone, you know, to work with who can just understand the nuances of culture.
Thank you, makes sense. Maithreyi, would you agree with that?
Yeah, I agree. And it just makes you feel more at home, you know, because you expect empathy and respect. Not that it's lacking in companies where there are no South Asian people employed, but here there is just that feeling of comfort which helps you open up. This has been my first experience and it's been great, so I really have nothing else to compare it with. But I think it's important to feel respected with who you work with.
Absolutely. And Taha?
No, I completely agree. I think it's very good to have that representation, and it makes it easier to just, you know, for other people to empathize. But I still feel that that's not entirely important. I think I'd be quite happy working with someone who isn't from my culture. I think I'd learn more from that as well. So as long as it's not an adversarial relationship, I'd be happy with that. So yeah.
Thank you.
And I would add that of course I am from South Asia, but that's not why certainly Neem Tree Press took your stories. We took your stories because they're great stories, and I think that's what we look for. So in a sense, we're agnostic to our authors, and I think that is the way that many publishers should be. At the end of the day, and I think it's sort of what you said, Taha, that it's really the characters, it's the setting, it's being authentic to wherever you're writing from, and authenticity in your characters. That's important. Yeah. So.
Thank you. We have another one that's just come in. So Naveen has said, I don't want to write for the money, but I also want to be able to write full-time without having to do another job. I'm getting ahead of myself, but what are your experiences with advances and funding your writing? If this is one that anyone's comfortable answering.
You know, I'm actually dealing with that question myself. This point in my life, I recently quit my full-time job, which was strange because I was teaching creative writing in a college, and it took so much of my time that it left me with no time to write. So it just didn't add up, and I quit. And I'm currently living on my savings, and I admit it's rather precarious. I am not making a living from my writing just yet. I would like to at some point of time, but I don't want to count on it right now. So I think it's important. You know, it's gone are the times where it was fashionable to be impoverished, and you know, these writers who are living on one meal a day, that sort of thing. It doesn't work like that. You have to feel secure. You have to feel content with what you're doing to be able to write well. So it is a balance, and I'm trying to address this question myself. I can live on my savings for a certain period of time, but then I will have to think about what to do next. So, you know, one's got to decide their priorities. While I don't want to quit writing ever, I also don't want to put everything away and put so much pressure on it that I start playing the gallery, because I do want to write for myself, and I do want to get pleasure out of writing. Sorry, that was no advice really. It was just me presenting my confused state of affairs.
And can I intervene here as a publisher? So I think that as far as the so when you know, it's interesting you say you don't want to write for the money, but as a publisher we want you to write for the money because we are a for-profit entity. And so I think once you decide to embark seriously on authorship as a career, you have to view it as any other job, and you have to build your brand, and you have to know what your genre is. So I would say that of course, if you're writing entirely for yourself and there isn't ultimately going to be an audience, then then that's a very different question. But I think that if you wish to be a published author, certainly as publishers, we like people who are have multiple novels in them and not just one, because it takes us time to build and help build a brand for an author. And as far as money is concerned, margins are extremely tight. And I don't know if you saw in the latest, the Penguin Random House and Simon Schuster merger that didn't happen. A huge, vast number of books don't make money. I mean, they literally do not break even. And so I think that when one embarks, I presume, on the pathway of an author, which I haven't, I am a publisher, you have to be in it for the long haul, because you don't know which book will be the one that will take off. And as publishers, it's similar in the sense that we are taking on a number of books, and it's frankly quite difficult to know which one is going to take off. And that is probably true of the larger publishers as well as the smaller ones. And so it is a little bit of a gamble to a certain extent, but it's a pleasure of writing, really. So, and for us, a pleasure of publishing and getting, new voices out there. It really is a thrill. It is an absolute thrill when a submission comes in and you're like, it clicks. It just clicks. It's right for this publishing house. It's absolutely fantastic.
Yeah, I just like to say that, when I said I write for myself, it's not like I write a journal for myself. It's not like journal keeping. Of course, I want to be read. Of course, I would love for my books to be sold a lot and make a lot of money. But as I said, I also want to be realistic and, keep a fair balance there. While that's a desire, I don't want to, talk about it all the time and face disappointment, because it is a gamble, as you said. So I just want to make sure that I'm secure on a certain front so that I can keep writing, and because I really don't want to lose the joy of writing. That's basically it.
Thank you. Taha, Safinah, do you have anything to add to that? Otherwise, I'll jump into the next Q&A question.
So I was on a similar journey with writing. I also quit my full-time job in 2019. I was a journalist for all those years, and I decided I'd teach on the side and I'd write. I don't think I made much money as a writer. I did a lot of writing, though. I think it really helped me become a better writer, just doing all that work. But I mean, this is something a hater once said to me: don't quit your day job. And obviously that wasn't meant to be advice. It was meant to be a snarky comment online. But I took that advice, and I think it's good to keep something on the side to, shore you up so you don't lose sight of yourself. Because most writers are very idealistic also. They feel, okay, hopefully this is going to get me somewhere, but it doesn't. And it's fine. As I said, it's all, as I said, a gamble, or it's just, it's fate, it's destiny. If it happens, it happens. If it doesn't happen, at least you have the joy of writing a book. I think that's all there is. We do it for the love of it as opposed to what we gain, but we do question whether we'll ever be able to gain from it. So yeah.
You will one day, soon.
Safinah, do you have anything to add to that?
I mean, just a quick sentence or two. I think most writers do related jobs. I just call it related jobs because it's either teaching creative writing, in terms of workshops, or at a university. I run a publishing house. People write for the news, they're journalists. So something related, even at the residency, out of 32 writers, I think 30 people were working somewhere or the other. A lot of them were poets. So, when we talk about the hierarchy, we would be like, okay, this guy is a poet, so he definitely needs a day job. We would just laugh it off. But it's the truth. One needs to, I think, and you have to give yourself time as a writer. You cannot expect to just, hit the sixer with the first book. So I think just
Absolutely.
Give yourself time and don't rush to quit that job. But when you feel like you need more time to write, like Maithreyi said, you will know when the time comes where you're at that, crossroads. Otherwise, related jobs.
Thank you. We've just got a few more. Okay, so this is a bit more to do with diving into your Neem Tree Press books. So here we have a question.
There's one from Penny. Did you get that one?
Oh.
From Penny Wood?
Oh, yeah, sorry for missing that, Penny. So this one is to do with favorite books. So Penny says, I'd love to know everyone's favorite book or author, either South Asian or not. If we start with you, Safinah.
Oh, favorite book question always gets me. There's so many that I love. At the top of my head, The Color Purple by Alice Walker, Demon Copperhead by Barbara Winslow, The Promise by Damon Galgut. I mean, there's so many. There can't be only three. There's, I think, at least like 30 books that I love that I'd call my favorite.
Do you feel like that falls into a particular genre in general, or is it?
Contemporary, literary, thriller, fiction, mystery, sometimes fantasy. I mean, pretty much everything.
Thank you. And Taha?
I think it varies with time. Like just last week, I was reading a lot of Annie Ernaux's memoirs, so I feel like that's a favorite author. But one of the things I do every year is I pick up one Anita Desai book and I just read it. And I love her. I just absolutely love her work. And I don't know why. Maybe it's just the way she uses language. Some people feel she's a second-rate writer. I don't agree with that. Absolutely. I think she's terrific. And I could never write like that, but she's just brilliant. And obviously, I mentioned The God of Small Things. I could never achieve that form of linguistic gymnastics. I don't even think throughout my career. But anyway, yeah, it keeps changing with time. You ask me this question tomorrow, I'll have another answer to tell you something.
Thank you. Maithreyi?
Yeah, well, my favorite writers, favorite books are always evolving, changing, and but there's been one constant. I'm a big admirer of Salman Rushdie's writing, and I read his works very early on. In fact, a little too early, when I did not have the emotional or linguistic maturity to appreciate all that was going on, but it was still very, very engaging, and I've been reading him over the years, and I am a steadfast fan. I mean, I love lots of other writers as well, but Salman Rushdie remains at the top three at all times.
Thank you. I've just seen another question come through from Sidi. This one says, as an artist, I find it can be difficult for my art to be taken seriously in the UK, as there is an expectation for my work to be about my Pakistani heritage, like what you were saying earlier. Even though that's not what my work embodies. Have you guys ever been in a situation similar to this? I know some of you have touched on this, if anyone has anything to add. Maithreyi, have you experienced that kind of expectation to present certain themes in your work at all?
No, I haven't actually faced that kind of problem because my work was about India, and I was set in India about Indian characters, and that is the one that I relate so closely to. But I don't think that should be a constraint. It's just a matter of time, and if you love your writing, if you're confident in what you write, even if it's not about your own heritage, whatever, particularly if it's not about your own heritage, I think you should just be steadfast in your craft and keep pushing. And perhaps the publishers you've met so far are not right for you. Just keep pushing, find a good agent, and hopefully someday it will be taken seriously. That's basically all I have to say. I don't think we should feel compelled to write about certain themes or settings based on the opinion of a limited number of people.
Yeah, thank you. Safinah, do you have anything to add to that?
Again, I think I mentioned it before as well. My work hasn't been intentional that way. I don't intend to represent, my city, my country in a certain way, but because most of my characters are based here, it ends up being Pakistani, in terms of food or in terms of the characters facing, the kind of challenges that we face in everyday life, or the cultural values and language. I think it just comes across as that. It's not really intentional for me.
Yeah. Yeah, and Taha, I know you said about your main interest being in terms of like the personal setting and like that family setting, rather than kind of deliberately trying to include like political elements? I guess maybe you've already answered that question, but if you have anything else to add.
It's interesting because a few years ago when I was just starting out, I remember an editor saying, yeah, you should write a collection of short stories. These days, Pakistani writers who write about terrorism and migration, wow, they're selling like hotcakes, write that. And I'm just sitting there thinking, okay, my experience of migration was not very unpleasant. I was in the UK for 3 years studying a degree. It's very, comfortable. So if you want a comfortable narrative, I mean, that doesn't really challenge anything, then sure, I'll do that. And I have no experience with terrorism at the giving or the receiving end. So clearly I can't write that. So I didn't do it. I think you can always say, I'm sorry, I don't want to do this. I think this is not for me. And the thing is, your interest will also evolve as a writer, because I remember writing some very, intense historical fiction. When I started, my first novel was about partition. So people automatically assumed that I would write historical fiction, and they would insist that, okay, write the story, set it in, this era and that era. I'm like, no, I'm not doing that. I'm not interested in that anymore. So you can always say, I'm sorry, I can't do this. And maybe your book is ahead of its time. Maybe, you haven't met the right publisher yet. So yeah.
Yeah, so I do think that in a way, if you live in South Asia, you possibly have an advantage than South Asians who are living in the UK. So there is, I think, in some ways, people living in quote unquote home countries have that freedom and don't have the baggage of the UK publishing scene wanting them to write specific stories because of their specific experiences in the UK. So I think, Sidi, it may be a bit of that you're experiencing, and yes, that is tough. Why can't one of us, if you like, write an Agatha Christie with all white people, because we meet a lot of them, right? So, and we've imbibed that culture. But that's, it's an interesting discussion, and I think ultimately, probably for the right publisher, is down to the authenticity of the story, as opposed to who's writing it, really. So, and I'm a believer in lived experiences, and so it's not really, we all have multiple identities, and we've all, traveled, lived in different places. So for me, it really is, as long as the story is authentic, and the world is a really interesting one that holds together very well. That, for us anyway, at Neem Tree Press, is what's important.
Absolutely. So I think that wraps up the questions in the chat. We have a few that were sent over on email, a bit more geared towards diving into the Neem Tree Press books. So one that we have here says, if you could spend a day with one of your characters from these 3 books respectively, who would it be, and what would you do? So if we jump back to Taha, maybe?
Okay, oddly enough, it would be Nazia. We don't get to see her in the book. I don't want to give too much away, but I remember working on edits and reading the book finally a few months ago, and I realized, okay, this is interesting. I want to know more about her. And if I would ever, spend time with her, I'd probably know more about her. I know certain things, obviously, but maybe a prequel with her, the journals of Nazia or whatever. That would be interesting to do, but I would never do that because that just takes the mystery away from this. But obviously Nazia, because there's so much more to discover.
Yeah, makes sense. Safinah, what about you?
Somebody asked me this at the launch that, if there would be a sequel, who would you want the main character to be? And instantly I wanted it to be Gulshan. I mean, she's not even one of the main characters, but she's just so cool. I mean, she's such a great support system. She screams sisterhood when Nadia needs her. I think I would like to spend a day with her.
Thank you. And Maithreyi?
Oh, it would have to be Baobab. Although he's not exactly the main character, he's one of the main characters. His original name is Cajetan Pereira, but he becomes Baobab because I've portrayed him in a way to be the embodiment of the spirit of the Baobab tree. And I think he and I would, he's an introvert as I am, and I think he would be the kind of person I would like to share a silent space with without it getting awkward. Whereas Sylvia herself, I think because she would be quite similar to me, that there would be some kind of friction between us. Whereas Baobab is a quiet character. He's had a very rich and interesting past. He's traveled a lot, and he's found his own way. And I would love to spend time with him to understand him more. Although he's somebody that I've created out of my mind, but I would still like to respect him as an individual and learn from him.
Thank you. I think we have time for one more question. So we had one come through related to writing rituals or special habits. Do any of you have any tips that you'd like to share in terms of your writing process? So if we jump back to Safinah.
I like to keep eating when I'm writing. There has to be snacks. And I'm such a health freak otherwise. So I maintain my life around exercise and clean eating. And whenever I'm writing, there has to be like my chili chips and my chocolate coated almonds. So if I were to write all the time, I don't know what would happen.
Thank you. Taha, do you have any unusual habits you'd like to share?
Nothing unusual. I sometimes I write on my laptop, but I also write on my phone. It's a terrible habit, but I usually work on a Google Doc, and it makes it easier for me to just have it on my phone in case something happens while
Something
I'm
comes to you
somewhere. Yeah, and I just put it down. And people find it strange that you write on your phone, because I think the image of the writer, someone who's just hammering away on a keyboard, or just that quill that we associate with writing.
Typewriter.
Yeah, or the typewriter for that matter. It just maybe it takes away from that image. So when they say you write on your phone, I'm like, yeah, I'm sorry, I have things to do. I can't just keep.
It's the modern world, yeah.
The modern world, yeah. So.
And Maithreyi, what about you? Anything?
Yeah, I'm very boring old school in my writing rituals. I have to have no distractions whatsoever because I get distracted very quickly and very easily. So absolutely no music, no nothing. It has to be silent and quiet, and the place has to be clean and neat and orderly. I clean up before I sit down to write, and things have to be kept at orthogonal angles. There can't be anything, a notebook or pencil sticking out at an odd angle. So I'm quite a bit of a, I have my OCDs about these things. So yeah, and I am the sort of person who gets up to clean in the middle of a writing session because suddenly it's something is kind of blown in my mind. But otherwise, I'm quite boring. I write on my laptop and nowhere else.
Yeah. Morning or night, Maithreyi?
Morning, absolutely. I'm not a night owl at all. I can't. In fact, this is my. I had to down 2 cups of coffee to be up at this hour. It's because it's midnight and I go to bed by 10 o'clock. I'm really boring. I'm a morning person.
And Taha, morning or evening?
I used to be an evening and night person, but now I've started a morning ritual because I suppose as you grow older, you need the night to sleep. But yeah.
And Safinah, when do you write? Morning or evening?
Night. That's the only peaceful time I get. So starting evening onwards, when the kids have their TV time, I generally sit then. And it's not every day for me. Some days I'll sit for hours, and some days I'll just be hopping around.
Thank you, everyone. I think that wraps up our questions. So yeah, if anyone has anything else to add, any last minute questions to come through, we'll try to answer them. But if not, thank you everyone for joining us. It's been a really interesting discussion. We've recorded the session, so we'll also try to put it out on social media if anyone wants to revisit anything that was discussed. Yeah, thank you. And it's the last day of South Asian Heritage Month, so we've squeezed this in. I'm glad we got the time to talk about this because it's really important.
Thank you so much for having us. It was quite a
So
lovely
much.
conversation. It was lovely to see everyone.
Yeah, me too. It was so fun. It was so casual. You know, I mean it in the best sense. I always prepare for sessions, but today I didn't have the time for it. It just felt like a nice conversation between friends. Thank you for
It
organizing
was
it. And
a
thank you.
natural, free-flowing conversation. I had fun.
Great. Yeah, I really
Thank you
enjoyed
so
it
much.
too. Thank you. And thanks to everyone who's attended the session. Yeah, we'll start logging off. Thank you. Enjoy the rest of your evening. If there's anything left of it, might be late where you are.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Bye. I always